We'll get started so we don't lose time. I'm Bill Alford, faculty member here at the Law School, Vice Dean for International Affairs. And I'm representing Dean Minow today. Unfortunately, she's a dear friend of Secretary Mabus. She can't join us because of a dean's meeting. And also, I've had the pleasure of knowing Secretary Mabus for well on 35 years, I think it is.
Closer to 40.
Yes, hate to admit it, right. So anyway, today's session is as follows. We'll start with a few questions from myself to Secretary Mabus about various parts of his illustrious career. And then we'll open the floor for you to ask questions of your own. When you ask a question, please do, as a courtesy, identify yourself. Everything is being taped to be put up on the web. Secretary Mabus has had an extraordinary career since graduating from Harvard Law School. He's state auditor of Mississippi, then the youngest governor in the nation, governor of Mississippi, and ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And for the last 8 years, Secretary of the U.S. Navy, the longest-serving Secretary of the U.S. Navy since Josephus Daniels a century ago. Very impressive. So I'd like to start, Mr. Secretary, if I could, with your early time coming to Harvard Law School. So prior to coming to Harvard Law School, you were in the Navy as Lieutenant JG. Listed on the U.S. Little Rock?
USS Little Rock.
So what was it like coming out of the Navy into Harvard Law School?
Well, two things. One, big mistake politically to come here. I never ran a campaign that it wasn't used against me. But I met that by telling a story that had the added advantage of being true, which I basically did an ad on this. I'm from a town of 1,000 people.
Ackerman, Mississippi.
Ackerman, Mississippi. My dad owned the hardware store there. And after the Navy, I was walking down Main Street, coincidentally the only street with any stores on it. And I ran into Mrs. Whittington, the librarian, who said, she was in her 70s then, she said, "So what are you going to do now that you're out of the military?" And I said, I'm going to law school. She said, "Are you going to Ole Miss, son?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I'm going to Harvard." And she said, "Couldn't you get in to Ole Miss?" And meant it. The second thing, though, it was interesting. I'd just come out of the Navy, as you said. Law school seemed actually pretty easy. It always stayed in the same place. You could wear anything you wanted to. If you didn't show up one day, you didn't get thrown in jail. And you could quit, none of which was true in the Navy. But I thought it was a pretty big advantage over classmates who had come straight out of college, because they seemed to be way more stressed than me about being a 1L.
So other than being political fodder for opponents in election races, how did the Harvard Law School experience serve you and for the work you've done since?
You know, it's been, well, those years, the Navy and Harvard Law School have been some of the touchstones of my life. I mean, the Navy taught me discipline and responsibility. Harvard and Harvard Law, number one, just making the friends that I made, many of whom I've kept for a lifetime, and being around that caliber of people, and that thoughtful, just was huge for me. And the rigor of the law and how you think about problems and how you approach problems, I mean, it gave me a completely different framework to do that. And I think whatever success I've had, not much of it would have been possible without either one of those things, the Navy or Harvard Law. And I still think that Harvard Law, just in the way they approach subjects, the way that there is this analytical precision, and I use the term again, rigor, that you have to master to do well in law school just serves you year after year after year when you get out, whether you are a lawyer, as so many of my friends here did for a career, or whether you were like me and Dean Alford and I were in the same law firm. I put it that way. He actually practiced law. I was in the law firm. But going into other professions. One other thing, because I went here, I think it made one thing possible. I clerked on the Fifth Circuit and my first year out. And that, I mean, the first proposed opinion I turned into my judge, I'd written about 36, 37 pages. It came back at 8 pages and said the same thing, only better. And it set a standard for writing. And I'm very bad in every job I've had about memos I get. I want them to be in English, and I want them to be understandable. And I and Tom Opal, who is here somewhere, who was my chief of staff and was my communications director when I was governor, chief of staff at Navy, we had a bad habit of just scrawling across things. He would scrawl English across it and send it back. I would scrawl better memo and send it back without giving any guidance as to how it should be better, because most of the time we couldn't understand exactly what people were saying. But the importance of communication, the importance, and I learned that here in law school, the importance of being clear in what you were saying, because the professors here had astoundingly small patience for when you were not clear.
Well, we're going to talk mostly about your time as Secretary of Navy, but before that, maybe a few quick questions about your stint as first state auditor and then the youngest governor in the nation. And I remember bringing the first Chinese ambassador to the U.S. on Dixie 2, which you sent up to fetch us down to the governor's mansion in Mississippi for truly eye-opening for him experience. Anyway.
And not always in a good way.
Well, yes, that's another set of tales. But I recall very vividly when you became governor, a photograph in I think it was the New York Times Magazine of 3 Southern Ivy League educated governors, Buddy Roemer of Louisiana, yourself, and a fellow named Clinton from Arkansas. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your time as governor, your aspirations at that point, the lessons you learned as governor in Mississippi.
Well, I was practicing law in Washington. Just by luck, a person I admired greatly in Mississippi politics named William Winter, who had run twice for governor before and gotten crushed both times for being too progressive. On filing deadline day, threw in his papers in 1979 and got elected due to a set of circumstances that weren't there before and never been there since. That was the only year he could have possibly been elected. But he asked me to come home, be his legal counsel and his legislative assistant. When I told the law firm that the dean and I were in, that I was going home to Mississippi to be the governor's legal counsel, one of my friends there said, how much are you going to get paid? And I said, about 1/3 of what I make here. And he said, why would the governor want somebody dumb enough to do that on his staff? But we passed the first Education Reform Act in the nation during that time that I was with Governor Winter. We had lost twice in the legislature. Mississippi legislature, maybe not the most progressive, forward-thinking body on earth, but there were a group of us in our late 20s, early 30s that worked for him. His name was Winter. We were very derisively called the Boys of Spring, and because we were young, because we didn't comply with norms that the legislature had been used to. And we basically convinced the governor, and he was great at it, to run a campaign for education. We had rallies, we raised money, We made speeches. We would speak to anybody. I made 700 speeches for education. And we gave out cards. If you're for a brighter future for your children, if you're for a better Mississippi, sign up. This was long before emails, but we'll send you updates as to where we are, and we'll ask you to make one phone call, and it'll be important. And the legislature at that point was used to, if somebody got 1 or 2 calls, it was an emergency, and we could generate 300 or 400 calls. We passed that bill. The newspaper that we got involved with there won a Pulitzer for covering it, and 3 of the boys of spring ran for statewide office. Winter was term limited. I was a bachelor, and I ran for state auditor, which was the most powerful job I'd ever seen, ever read about. Now, I'd never had an accounting course, had no idea how to do an audit. Luckily, that was not a requirement. All you had to do was get more votes. And it was a slow summer. The press tuned into that race. Every start of every week had a press conference in Jackson, and then drove 900 miles around Mississippi to the 10 media markets and used props and stuff. And there was 3 auditors who had been bribed by a county official, and they'd been bribed with steak, seafood, and whiskey. And this county official went to jail. The 3 auditors, nothing happened to them. So I had a press conference, waved a whiskey bottle over my head, and said, "How safe do you feel? These folks got bribed, and they're still trying to audit your money." I won in a landslide, 51.5%, and got outspent 5-1 in that campaign. But then the FBI and I went on to put a pretty large percentage of county officials in jail in Mississippi. Everybody knew folks had been stealing. They just didn't think anybody would be crazy enough to do anything about it. I was told by every elected official in Mississippi I was committing political suicide, but I had my dad, who thought politics was an absolutely horrible thing to do and tried everything he could to talk his son out of doing it. But when I decided to do it, the one piece of advice he said was be honest. Be honest with the voters, but be honest with yourself. Do the right thing. It doesn't matter what it costs you politically. And so I ran for governor. Actually got elected governor the first time I was constitutionally eligible, because you have to live in Mississippi for the 5 preceding years before you can be elected. And got the biggest vote anybody's ever gotten running for governor in Mississippi. Stressed one thing, and that was education. My slogan was, "Mississippi will never be last again." Mississippi was dead solid last in every single metric you could find. Didn't matter whether it was per capita income or educational attainment or anything. And we became obsessed with metrics. And Mississippi moved out of last place in every single thing in the 4 years that I was governor. Buddy Romer got elected exactly the same day that I did in Louisiana. Well, actually, he got elected much earlier, although the same year. He only had to run 1 election. I had to run 3. But as he put it, Louisiana counts votes differently from any other state. And Clinton had been governor for a while and was extraordinarily helpful in terms of what you did as governor and how you organized your office and this sort of stuff. And I talked about this with the National Security Fellows this morning, the big lesson I learned there in leadership, because Mississippi was the poorest state in the nation, and every day there were about 1,000 things that I could do to make life better. I mean, every day. But if you tried to do all 1,000, you would fail in all of them. And so you had to narrow your focus. And that's hard, because you're going to leave stuff out, and it's important stuff, and it's stuff that people care about. And you just have to keep one eye on the present and make sure you're doing that right. But if you let yourself be consumed by the day-to-day and don't look 15, 20 years down the road, it's what you're doing, you will ultimately end up failing that too. And same education, the money you spend on early childhood education returns it 17 times, but it's 20 years later. Same thing with shipbuilding. You've got to build ships early, and because you will not see those ships because it takes so long to build it. But if you don't, the fleet 10, 15 years from now will be diminished.
Maybe we'll use that to transition to your time as Secretary of the Navy. So there are so many things we could talk about, but let me start maybe with one of the more contentious, the South China Sea. I wonder if you could say something about your objectives, the challenges you encountered, and the lessons that you've taken away from that about engaging a rising China.
Well, thanks in large part to being Alford. I had been to China in 1978. Before relations were normalized, I probably made 24 trips while I was in the private sector, and as governor, went there. But when I took office in 2009, China was much more reserved in terms of its actions. And beginning probably in 2013, 2014, it became far more assertive and maybe aggressive in terms of island building, in terms of sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. And our position, Navy's position, U.S. government's position was, we don't take sides in terms of territorial disputes. However, what we do take seriously is freedom of navigation, following international law and norms. One of the things we talked about in an earlier class was how the fact that the U.S. has not ratified UNCLOS, the UN Law of the Sea Convention on the Law of the Sea, undercut some of the arguments that we made. But we saw our job as not letting the status quo be changed unilaterally and by one country or by force. And so we would do freedom of navigation exercises within 12 miles of these artificial islands. We'd do overflights of these. And, but we'd also engage. I mean, I went to China as secretary in 2012, in late 2012. And we worked out a code of conduct at sea in terms of unplanned encounters. We worked on things like submarine rescue, medicine, naval medicine, which were non-contentious items. The Chinese, when I visited, the Chinese leadership all had the same talking points about you need to quit doing these intelligence gathering flights and ships. And my response was, well, you know exactly where we are. We do it within bounds of international law, and we tell you where we're going to be. But also, you must think it's valuable because in 2012, Rim of the Pacific, you had an intel ship there. Rim of the Pacific is the largest naval exercise in the world every other year, and you had an intel ship there gathering intelligence. And our response was to invite you to the next one, not to say you need to quit gathering intel. It's just come on in, which the Chinese have participated in 2014 and 2016. And in 2014, the other thing that showed up was their intel ship, 4 warships and their intel ship. We never did quite know if they were gathering intel on us and the other nations or if they were gathering intel on their own ships, or both. But I think it's important to engage. And our ultimate goal, which we tried to state publicly over and over again, was not to stop the rise of China, not to stop them from becoming a great power or a great naval power, but as they grew and as they became more powerful, to accept the responsibilities that came with that power. To be a guardian of international norms and freedom of navigation, because the economies of the of Asia, the economies of the world, but particularly the economies of Asia, and especially China, are doing as well as they are because of the United States Navy, because we have been the dominant Navy for 70 years, and we kept the sea lanes open for everybody engaged in free commerce. The last thing I'll say is one of my jobs as secretary was to have enough ships, because our fleet was shrinking when I got there. It was shrinking dramatically, and we turned that around, and now it's growing. But was to have enough ships so that we could always have a presence in places like the South China Sea, that there would never be a gap. And the underpinning for that was we're always there. So if something happens, we don't have to surge ships. We don't have to show up suddenly. And so we're not escalating. We're there already. Now, when you surge and you send a lot of new ships in or forces of any kind, it can certainly be taken, and sometimes is, a big escalation, and so it may lead to counter escalations. Now, it didn't always, the country on the other side has to agree that you're already there and that it's not an escalation, and that didn't always work, but that was the philosophical and legal underpinning that we used.
Speaking of ships, I recall at the beginning of your tenure as secretary, you mentioned that the two issues you would, among thousands, that you would start by focusing upon were China and energy. And I wonder if you could say a little bit, please, about your experience in trying to create a quote-unquote green Navy, and about some of the controversy and challenges that evoked.
When I became secretary, I left the Navy on January 16th, 1972. I had very little contact until May 19th, 2009. 37 years there. But I thought that was a great strength, because while I didn't know what the issues facing Navy was, I also had no baggage. I had no way of thinking about it. And so in my preparation, and the Pentagon does a very good job of getting you ready for hearings and also for the job, I started identifying issues, and one of them was energy. Energy can be used as a weapon. If you want to see how, look at what Russia did to Crimea, look at what Russia did to Ukraine, look at what Russia tried to do to Europe before the price of oil made that almost impossible, the dip in the price of oil. And I didn't want that to be used as a weapon against us. It was a military vulnerability, tactically and strategically. For example, in Singapore, there's an oil refinery owned mainly by the Chinese. Right down the road is a biofuel refinery owned by a Finnish company. I don't want to be dependent on any country, but maybe particularly on China for fueling our warships in the Western Pacific. We were also, tactically, we were losing a Marine killed or wounded for every 50 convoys of fuel that came into Afghanistan. That was too high a price to pay. So I came up with goals for the Navy and Marines, the biggest of which was by no later than 2020, at least half of all energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources. Now, we got there 5 years early on our basis. We got there in 2015. Today, we get more than 60% of our energy on our basis from alternatives. At sea, we're about 35%. Half of that's nuclear. The other half is biofuels. And we're using energy differently. Those Marines, at the height of the fighting in Afghanistan, we just passed out rollable solar panels that they could stick in their pack. Saved a company of Marines 700 pounds of batteries that they didn't have to haul with them, and they didn't have to be resupplied. We've got SEAL teams in the field, net zero in terms of energy and water, because they use alternative energy, solar, wind, to purify water so they can stay out almost indefinitely. We built different kind of ships, hybrid ships, electric motors for speeds under 12 knots, normal gas turbines for speeds over 12 knots. First one of those, a huge ship, the Macon Island, a big deck amphibious ship. Its first deployment came back with half its fuel budget, and stayed at sea 44 days longer than any other ship with it. Changing the light bulbs. Changing the light bulbs in a destroyer to LEDs saves 20,000 gallons of fuel a year for that destroyer. So, but it was not without controversy. A congressman at a hearing said pretty loudly, "You're the Secretary of the Navy, you're not Secretary of Energy." And my response was, "Yeah, I've got more money than the Secretary of Energy. I can do more." And the Navy has always led in energy. I mean, sail to coal, coal to oil, pioneering nuclear for propulsion. Every single time there were people that said, "This is not going to work, dumb idea." Every time they were wrong. They're wrong now, too. And it's become part of the culture of the Navy and Marines. It could be reversed, but you will make the force weaker. You will make us a less effective warfighting force. Last thing I'll say is we framed the debate, and successfully, on national security grounds, that this was a national security issue. This was a warfighting issue. And it's true. I mean, it made us better fighters. But started talking 3 or 4 years ago also about climate change and how the Navy, Marine Corps are the first responders. So as the Arctic begins to melt and sea lanes open, Russia has already said that the waters to its north are internal waterways. They're not. The U.S. Navy will be the one called to keep those open. There's more potential for conflict because of mineral exploration and oil exploration in the Arctic. As sea levels rise, a lot of times instability follows. And again, the Navy and Marines are the first responders. And we're the Navy. Our bases tend to be on the sea. As sea levels rise, our bases become at risk. And Norfolk is at risk soon. I mean, within the next 2 or 3 decades, Norfolk could become at risk. And that's the biggest naval base in the world. It could just go away with sea level rise. So there are a lot of reasons, and they're all good, to worry about climate change and to try to do something about it. And we were uniquely positioned to do something about it because DOD is the largest single user of fossil fuels on Earth. And Navy and Marine Corps about 40% of that.
Thank you. So you've often said that personnel and values are as important as the hardware for the armed services. I wonder if you could describe your efforts to integrate women more fully into the Marine Corps, the resistance you encountered, and how you see things at present.
Well, again, the reason for doing it, and I put women on submarines in 2010, on riverines in 2010, women in ground combat, so it wasn't women in combat. Women have been fighting and dying in combat for a long time, but infantry, artillery, armor for the Marines, special forces for the Marines, and the Navy SEALs for the Navy. In 2016, January 1st, 2016 was when that took effect. The whole reason for doing it was to make the force stronger. A more diverse force is a stronger force. And it's not diversity for diversity's sake. It's diversity in thought, in action, in background, in experience. If you become too homogeneous as a military force, you become too predictable. And a predictable military is a defeatable military. And it's the same reason for bringing ROTC back to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. Same reason for establishing ROTC at Rutgers and Arizona State, the 2 most diverse campuses in America. Same reason for appealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And my notion, and I think it's a good one, is that the only qualification to get a job should be the qualification to do a job. So the Marines did a test on women in ground combat. And they had a gender-integrated unit and an all-male unit, and they sort of tested them against each other. One of the things that they discovered, which surprised everybody, was that there were no standards, individual standards in the Marines. If you were a man and graduated from boot camp, you were assumed to be able to be in the infantry. About 20% of the men couldn't do it. Now, we were losing Marines because of that. So once you establish those standards, as they have been established, and once you don't relax them for any group, then, and if you prove you can do the job, if you meet the standards, then things like gender, things like color of your skin, things like who you love, ought to be irrelevant. Because for a Marine on the line, the thing that they need to know is that the Marine on either side of them has had to do exactly the same thing they did to qualify. And that if they get in trouble, the Marine on either side of them can do it. The pushback was interesting to me because we went back and looked at the pushback in terms of integrating the service in the late 40s from the Marines. We went back and looked at what people were saying in the 80s when larger numbers of women were being recruited. Looked at what people were saying before the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it was the same thing. It was exactly the same thing. They can't do it physically. A Marine commandant in World War II argued that African Americans could not fight in the heat, that they just would not be as effective as white folks doing that in the Pacific. A Marine commandant in 1993 said that African Americans just weren't as good at things like land navigation. And that's why we shouldn't recruit, shouldn't have nearly as many African American Marines. Same thing with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Unit cohesion will be destroyed. And all of these were just big nothings when it happened. And it was generational to a large extent. I think the gender integration is generational to a large extent. The one group, interestingly enough, that really had no problem with the notion of gender integration, because they haven't integrated yet, are the SEALs. Because they've had the same standards for years, and 80% of men don't make it. And so, you talk to SEALs, and they say, that's fine. We don't care who comes through, as long as they get through BUDS, as long as they get through the training. They're SEALs. Doesn't matter. And I think I told this story in class, but the last story I'll tell is one of the things that I did after making the decision on women in ground combat was I went to every major Marine base and had an all-hands call with all the Marines there and just talked to them and said, here's the basis of the decision, here's why I did it. And let them ask questions, let them push back. And it never got very contentious. Most of the young Marines didn't really care. Marines are told what to do basically 24 hours a day. And this was one more thing. Yeah, okay. But my last big event was in Beaufort, South Carolina at the Marine Air Station there. And after I made my little talk, the first question came from a guy my age who was a retired lieutenant colonel from the Marines. And he was yelling at me about this and saying, you're going to lose Marines. This is a terrible decision. Cohesion is going to be destroyed. The Marine Corps is going to hell in a handbasket. And so I pushed back and said, well, what's the problem? What's the problem here? If somebody meets the standards, why does it matter? How can we deny them the opportunity and really the honor of defending this country just because of the shape of their skin? And he finally looked at me and said, in Vietnam, we were in the field for 30 days at a time. Where are they going to go to the bathroom? And before I could answer, a woman who had been a Marine major who was on my staff, who went to the Kennedy School and the business school here, yelled out, tree line, like everybody else. And I looked at him and I said, really? You're in combat? And that's your concern? But again, I think it was generational. And I don't know if it's going to be rolled back, frankly. But if they do, if it's rolled back, it will make the Marines weaker. It will make the Navy weaker. It will make the Army and the Air Force weaker. And if they're going to roll it back, they ought to be honest about it, that they're just doing it out of misogyny, out of just a pure sexist impulse, and not because they're trying to help the military.
Thank you. So I think I'll turn to our audience. I just would conclude our discussion by noting that Secretary Mabus chose to name a number of new vessels after ships, after famous civil rights leaders, Sojourner Truth, Harvey Milk, Cesar Chavez, John Lewis, Robert F. Kennedy. And the argument he offered was that the strength of the U.S. Military, indeed the U.S., lies not only again in hardware, but in our values. And this was an exemplification. Let's open up to questions. And please quickly identify yourself. And as someone has said, questions usually end with a question mark. Who would like to ask? I think gentleman back here.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. I was in the Army when you made the choice about DADT. Well, not you personally, but the choice was made regarding DADT. And for all of us, we just woke up and it was a Tuesday and we went to work and the world didn't end and we didn't lose the war and it was a Tuesday. But the rest of the world seemed to lose its collective mind. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what you did kind of leading up to the change and then after the change in terms of just institutional leadership. You've done a lot of things that have, as we've talked about, inspired a lot of institutional resistance, be it naming some of the ships or women in combat or various things. What did you do as a leader to kind of prepare the ground and then deal with the fallout afterwards?
Well, one of the things that I did all the time at Navy was go out. I mean, I'm the most traveled senior executive in U.S. government history. Now, 152 different countries, 1,342,544 miles. I kept an odometer on my Facebook page. But I would go out mainly to see sailors and Marines where they were deployed. And one of the things I learned was if you did these all-hands calls and asked for questions, they would tell you what was on their mind. They would tell you what concerned people. There are not many shy folks join our military. And in the year leading up to the repeal of DADT, I got 2 questions on that. It just wasn't important. It just wasn't something that people were concerned about. And you're right, leading up to it, people did sort of lose their collective minds. There was some polling done that said 27% of Marines said they'd leave if you did that. Well, they might have left. I don't know. We replace about 25% of Marines every year. So they left, fine. I don't think they did. But one of the things that I did was go out and listen and just see how big an issue is this? How big a deal is this? And it was the same for the Navy and Marine Corps. I mean, it was a Tuesday. And it was a big nothing burger. Nobody cared much inside the service. Inside the Pentagon, it was different. And it was an age thing. It was, above a certain age, you were really worried. Below a certain age, you weren't. Now, I was above that age, way above that age, but I had 3 younger children, and all girls. And they would look at me when I would talk about the arguments against repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I didn't buy, but I would talk about it. They'd look at me the same way I would look at people when they'd talk about the arguments about segregation. I mean, it just made no sense. And so I was vocal and explained the reasons for it. One of the reasons for it was we couldn't get ROTC back here if we didn't repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I thought that was important. But we also, it made the force weaker. And the story that I tell along those lines, and I told it in a lot of places. I was in Manaus, Kyrgyzstan, which, We had a big base there. Everybody going into or out of Afghanistan went through Manaus. And I was there on a Tuesday or something, and just a random day, and there were about 800 sailors and Marines, half going in, half coming out. And after the all-hands call, a Navy corpsman, so a medic, came up to me. And we furnish the medics from the Marines. Marines don't have their own medical. The Navy does it. And he was a first-class petty officer. He'd been in 11 years. And he said, I want to thank you for pushing for the repeal. He said that he'd been in 11 years, he was gay, and that his biggest fear was that he was going to be found out and kicked out. Now, he had just finished his 3rd combat deployment. So 3 deployments of risking his life every single day. And yet his biggest fear was being kicked out for being gay. Now, how wrong is that? And how much more at risk were those Marines if he hadn't been there, simply because he was gay? And so I would tell that story, and I didn't get much pushback inside. I mean, it didn't require a whole lot of leadership to do that inside the military. It did outside with outside groups and with Congress and things like that. But I think the main thing is just the fundamental American notion of fairness.
Take some more questions? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for coming. Jeff Bowman, 1L here. I was wondering, with so many short-term political and budgetary pressures, how do you, as the head of a large organization, kind of keep the focus on the long-term and the strategic vision?
Well, for one thing, it's sort of like in Mississippi, you pick a very few things and you focus relentlessly on them. I picked 4 things: shipbuilding, platforms, well, all acquisition, ships, air, weapons, energy, and transforming that. Our partnerships, our worldwide partnerships, and our partnerships with the American people. Navy and Marine Corps, America's away team. Most people, you don't see them. We don't have a home game. We don't want a home game. But when sailors and Marines are doing their job, they're almost always a long way from home. And our force. How do you manage our people? How do you keep this great force that we have? How do you keep twice as many women from year 6 to year 12 leaving as men? And those were the 4 things. I mean, I just concentrated on those. And you have to leave other things out. You have to watch other things go by that you would like to work on, but they just couldn't do it. And again, the day-to-day stuff threatens to overwhelm you. But shipbuilding is a good example. I mean, the fleet that I had for the entire 8 years was determined in the early 2000s, the size of it. The ships that I built, and from 01 to 08, the Navy put 41 ships under contract. From 09 to 16, same number of years, I put 86 ships under contract with a 20% smaller top line. But the fleet never grew under me. In fact, it continued to decline because of those 41 ships. Only 41 ships were put in. We'll get back to 300 ships by 2019. We'll get back to 308, which is what we're building toward, by 2021. And I'll guarantee you, whoever the Secretary of the Navy is at the time and whoever the President is at the time will take complete credit for that. But if they don't keep building ships in 2019 and 2021, then the Navy of 2034 and 2035 is going to be much diminished. Because if you miss a year on a ship, you don't get it back. And so you have to keep that one eye on the present, but you have to keep that eye on the future. And you've got to be willing to understand that you're never going to get any credit for doing it.
Take a couple more questions. Yes.
Hi there. I'm wondering if we're going to see more or any more progressive state governments in the South in our lifetimes, and if so, for those of us who are interested in that sort of thing, how do we get there?
I don't know. I'm not completely optimistic. When I ran for governor in '87, when Clinton was governor of Arkansas and Romer was governor of Louisiana, but there were also a lot of good governors all across the South and had preceded us winter in Mississippi, Dick Riley in South Carolina, Chuck Robb in Virginia, and on the Senate level, people like Al Gore in Tennessee. And there were other factors, but an overwhelming factor was race. I never ran a campaign that the race card was not played. My coalition was African Americans and suburban Republicans, which is a strange coalition. But once one party figured out if they got all the white votes and we got all the black votes, they won every single time. The pendulum just swung, and you saw all those old segregationist Democrats just move over to become Republicans. And a Democrat can win in Mississippi with between 20 and 25% of the white vote, and we can't get there. I mean, 1 out of 5, we can't get there. And I think it's going to take, a concerted effort. I think that it's the same trick that's been used for 200 years in the South. Dividing based on race, because economically you're not divided, but divided based on race. And as Dr. King said, the only way you keep a man down in the ditch is getting down in the ditch with him. And I don't think it's any accident that so many of these southern states are having problems economically. So many of them are having problems educationally. So many of them are having these problems. I thought in 1987 we would lead the nation because Mississippi was too small to be geographically segregated. We knew each other. And that once de jure segregation was done away with, that de facto just didn't work. Mississippi is one of the most integrated states in the nation. I mean, 39% African American. But that was down from more than 60% in 1930. And the argument I used to make to Clinton was he was not a Deep South governor. 11% African American in Arkansas, 39% in Mississippi, 37% in South Carolina, 36% in Alabama. That the white people in Arkansas didn't think African Americans were going to take over. They did in Mississippi because we had more black elected officials by number than any other state. We had more than California, and we're 10 times smaller than California. So I think demographics are going to change. That's a slow change. And people are going to have to be more involved. I mean, the black vote does not turn out in proportion to its numbers. Barack Obama did pretty well in Mississippi because it did. But I lost my reelect in '91 to a white supremacist. And I'm not joking about him being a white supremacist. Tom Opal called him David Duke without the sheets. And I think he underestimated him. But the main reason I lost was there were 100,000 fewer voters in '91 than there were in '87. And about 95% of those were mine. And it was just because they thought I had it. I was 17 points ahead in every poll. Polling was right. People just didn't go to the polls to vote. And you got to actually do that. And you got got to stand up, and you're going to lose a lot. It's a marathon to be a progressive politician, I think almost anywhere, but particularly in the Deep South.
Another question? Yes, in the back, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for coming to speak to us today. If I can sort of piggyback on that question a bit, drawing on your experience as governor of Mississippi, there's obviously a lot of talk now in D.C. about changing U.S. trade policy, NAFTA, the TPP. As the governor of an economically struggling state, what kind of policy in D.C. would actually, do you think, be helpful for people in places like Mississippi?
Well, my argument always was, we, in the 50s and 60s, we raided plants from this area, from New England, from
Yes, you did.
the upper Midwest, because we promised cheap, non-union labor. And my argument was, we can't do that anymore, even in the late 80s. We're not going to be the cheapest. Mexico is going to be cheaper. Malaysia is going to be cheaper. Hungary is going to be cheaper. And that the only argument we can make is we got to be better. And that the one way to do that, the best thing you can do for that is education. There are no jobs, or not many jobs, for strong backs, weak minds anymore. And we've had a nationwide dropout rate from high school right at 30% for years. And you just cannot maintain a great economy doing that. And it's also hard to maintain democracy doing that, because democracy is a tough system. It requires people to think and requires educated people. And so the one policy you can do at the state level is do better in education. I don't think, at least history has showed us that protective policies, tariffs, barriers to entry and things like that end up hurting rather than helping. They may help in the short run, but not for very long, because those economic forces are not going to be changed. And the speed with which technology is moving, the way the economy is changing is just, is going so fast today that you've got to have people who are flexible and who don't quit learning all their lives, because they've got to change not just jobs, but careers a lot of times.
I think we have time for one last question before the end. Anybody like that? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your time. I was wondering, how do you deal with media pressure? Because media wants to have quick answers when something happens, and also the environment has changed a lot over the years. How do you deal with that?
Well, in a bunch of ways. One is I don't read comments on stories. I don't read Facebook. I don't do the, because the attacks always come, and there are people who have way too much time on their hands. But on the more regular media, one of the rules is bad news doesn't get any better with time. So if you've got something bad that happened, get it out there, own it, and tell them what you're going to do to stop it. Now, it's not going to stop bad press. You're going to get that, and you just got to accept it. You're just not going to stop erroneous press. You're just going to get that and accept it. I used to think you could change people's minds. I've pretty much given up on that. But you have to keep pushing information out. You have to be available. You have to not be inward looking and hidden. You got to deal with the press. You got to deal with media in different forms. I mean, you got to communicate through a Facebook, a Twitter, a Instagram, Snap, whatever, to push the message that you've got out. And I just think I don't think the so-called mainstream media has kept up with the changes. in technology and the way people get and process news. And I think they're going to have to change if they're going to remain relevant. But I think from my standpoint, it's just a matter of access, a matter of not being defensive, not and owning up to everything you did, but not to the things you didn't do. So if I could, just thank you again. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the questions, and thank you, Dean, for doing this.
We can't conclude without noting that Secretary Mabus appears to be the only person alive who has thrown out the first pitch in each Major League ballpark in the United States. And practice makes perfect, so by the 30th park, he was quite a curveball there.
Fenway 3 times. And a couple of those games, I was the best pitcher the Red Sox had.
Touche. I want to thank Secretary Mabus for offering a class and for speaking with us today.